Before we begin the video, if you've been getting value out of this channel, please consider supporting High Americana via Patreon, linked in the description. At $3,000 a month, you will help me make this a full-time job and can also request historical content to be made. Thank you. And now, a passage from Japan and the United States, 1853 to 1921, by Payson Jackson Treat, from Chapter 2, Peace and Friendship. The diplomatic relations between the United States and Japan cover a period of just 75 years, a brief span in the history of international intercourse, and this period, in turn, may be divided into three fairly well-defined phases, each with a distinct central theme and each set apart by a great event in the history of the island empire. Thus, the first phase deals with the establishment of friendship and commercial intercourse between the two countries. It covers the whole period of troubled relations, which ended only with the restoration of the emperor in 1868. The second phase covers the struggle of Japan to win admission to the family of nations and to maintain her place there. It might properly close with the revision of the treaties in 1894, although I believe the war with Russia lies within this middle period. It would be difficult to conceive of intercourse between two countries so different in race and culture conducted in a more creditable manner than that which prevailed in these 37 years. And finally comes the phase since the Russian War, from which Japan emerged as a world power with enlarged interests and responsibilities on the continent of Asia, a period in which contacts increased, and with contact came friction. A period in which popular opinion was molded by more or less reliable information, and a period in which wise statesmanship has been in demand on both sides of the Pacific. American interest in Japan had been slight until the middle of the 19th century. Japan had been closed to all foreign intercourse, save that of the Dutch and Chinese at Nagasaki, since 1638. And 2 years earlier, an edict had forbidden, under pain of death, the emigration of Japanese. No commerce could develop until the exclusion edicts were repealed and the ports of Japan again opened. Fortunately for Japan, her islands lay out of the track of the usual voyages from Europe and America to Canton in China, so there were few attempts to engage in trade with Japan. American ships, chartered by the Dutch government, carried on the trade between Nagasaki and Batavia during the Napoleonic Wars, and British ships performed this service while Java was held by Britain, 1811 to 1816, but otherwise there is no record of foreign ships trading with Japan, save the Dutch ships at Nagasaki, which after 1790 were limited to one a year. In the early 19th century, Russia was the European power most interested in Japan. In the very year that Japan adopted a policy of exclusion, 1638, the Russians had raised their standard on the Pacific at Okhotsk, and during the next 2 centuries they had consolidated their control until they were ready to move down upon the Amur region of China and the island of Sakhalin claimed by Japan. Russian explorers had already passed down the Kurile Islands toward Hokkaido. In the 18th century, Russian ships visited the main island, Honshu, and their activity in the north caused the shogunate to take active measures to defend the island of Hokkaido, while raids upon Sakhalin and some of the Kurile Islands early in the 19th century further alarmed the Japanese, who now realized that they must prepare to enforce their exclusion laws. If the Isles of Japan lay out of the course of ships in the China trade, they were brought within the field of foreign maritime operations when British and American whalers began to frequent the North Pacific about 1820. On the rocky fog-banked coast of the northern islands, not a few whalers came to grief, and all these ships would have welcomed a port of refuge there with wood and water and provisions obtainable. America's first interest in Japan grew out of the operations of her stout-hearted whalers. In 1832, and again in 1835, Mr. Edmund Roberts, American minister to Siam and Muscat, was furnished with letters to the Emperor of Japan and instructed to visit Japan to enter into negotiations for the opening of commercial relations. Unhappily, his death at Macau in 1836 prevented this first attempt of the United States to open official relations with Japan. Early in 1845, Mr. Zadok Pratt, a member of the House of Representatives from New York, submitted a resolution which recommended that immediate measures be taken for effecting commercial arrangements with the Empire of Japan and the Kingdom of Korea. Although the resolution was laid upon the table, yet within a few months the commander of the East Indies Squadron, Commodore James Biddle, was instructed to take the utmost care to ascertain if the ports of Japan were accessible. The American Commissioner to China, Mr. A.H. Everett, had been given letters of credence to Japan, and if he desired to visit that country, Biddle was to accompany him with his squadron, but should he decline to do so, then the Commodore might make the attempt himself, yet not in such a manner as to excite a hostile feeling, or a distrust of the government of the United States. These instructions resulted in the first official attempt to establish official intercourse between the United States and Japan. Commodore Biddle, with 2 ships of war, arrived in the Bay of Yedo on July 20th, 1846. A Japanese officer was told that the Commodore had come to see if Japan had opened her ports as China had done, and to fix the terms of trade by treaty. As Biddle refused to surrender the ship's guns and the muskets and swords of the crew, as was required of the Dutch at Nagasaki, the ships were surrounded by small guard boats. The Japanese refused to accept copies in Chinese of the first British, American, and French treaties with China, and it was only after protest that enough water could be secured for the ships. On the 27th, an explanatory edict was delivered to Biddle. The document was unsigned and unsealed, and its purpose was to explain why foreign trade would not be permitted. From time immemorial, it asserted the country had refused to trade with foreigners. No distinction was made between nations, and all were treated alike. The Dutch trade at Nagasaki was not to be regarded as furnishing a precedent, for the trade there was small and the whole affair of no importance. We are aware, it continued, that our customs are in this respect different from those of some other nations, but every nation has a right to manage its affairs in its own way. So permission to trade was positively refused, and Biddle was earnestly advised to depart and not to appear again upon that coast. When Biddle tried to enter the Japanese junk to receive the edict, a seaman, misunderstanding the situation, pushed him back into his own boat. Biddle took no offense at this, as every atonement expected was made and the man punished. But a report circulated abroad that the American officer had suffered a personal indignity. From this time, events moved more rapidly. Interest now centered in the fate of certain American seamen, some shipwrecked men and other deserters who had been arrested by the Japanese and, according to their exclusion laws, had been held in confinement until they could be sent to Nagasaki for repatriation by means of the annual Dutch merchant ship. Such was the fate of the survivors of the American whaler Lawrence, wrecked on May 27, 1846, off the Hokkaido. 8 survivors reached land, and one of these was afterward killed while attempting to escape. The remaining 7 were detained for 17 months before they were finally sent away from Nagasaki on a Dutch ship. Early in 1849, the Dutch consul at Canton advised the American commissioner there that 15 seamen were detained at Nagasaki, as they had arrived there too late to be sent away in the Dutch ship of 1848. Mr. Davis communicated this news to Commodore Geisinger, in command of the East India Squadron, and the latter promptly dispatched Commander Glynn in the Preble to Nagasaki. In his sailing instructions, Glynn was told to proceed to Nagasaki and obtain the release of the seamen. If the release was refused without orders from Yedo, then Glynn was to proceed there and make a firm, temperate, and respectful demand of that court for the immediate release and surrender to you of the above-mentioned prisoners. In your correspondence or intercourse with the Japanese, Glynn was instructed, your conduct will be conciliatory but firm. You will be careful not to violate the laws or customs of the country, or by any means prejudice the success of any pacific policy our government may be inclined to pursue. Nevertheless, you may be placed in situations and circumstances which cannot be foreseen, and on which special instructions cannot be given you in anticipation. In all such cases, every confidence is reposed in your discretion and ability to guard the interests as well as the honor of your country. And in conclusion, he was reminded that the protection of our valuable whaling fleet and the encouragement of the whale fisheries are objects of deep interest to our government, and he was told to be prompt to aid and promote these objects. Glynn's voyage was completely successful. The seamen proved to be 13 survivors of 15 deserters from the ship Lagoda, who had been under arrest since they landed on the Hokkaido in June 1848, and Ranald MacDonald, who had been set ashore at his own request about the same time from the whaler Plymouth. In securing the release of the seamen, Glynn had broken through the strict regulations regarding shipwrecked seamen. An American officer had dealt directly with Japanese officials, American seamen had been restored to an American ship rather than by a Dutch or Chinese vessel, and the transaction had taken place, presumably without reference to Yedo. The account of the treatment of the men of the Lawrence and Lagoda created an unfavorable impression in some quarters in the United States. In each case, the men had been kept in close confinement for months, at times even in bamboo cages, and they had been punished for attempting to escape. Furthermore, according to the laws dealing with the prescribed Christian religion, they had been compelled to trample upon a crucifix. All this was contrary to the American idea of the way in which helpless mariners should be treated, and it caused some to believe that a serious effort should be made to compel the Japanese to deal more humanely with shipwrecked seamen. As a matter of fact, the Japanese treated the seamen as well as could be expected in view of the stern exclusion edicts, and the real kindliness of the Japanese peasant folk was clearly brought out in their treatment of shipwrecked men in later years after the repeal of the exclusion laws. Just at this time, a new reason for American interest in Japan appeared. It was due to the raising of the American flag at the Golden Gate and the annexation of California. Then, direct voyages were made from San Francisco to Shanghai and Canton, and these brought American ships within the waters of Japan. And promptly, the desire arose to establish a steamship line to the Orient, but this would require coaling stations along the way, and one of these would have to be on one of the Japanese islands. This was the dominant reason in the decision to send out a second naval expedition to Japan. California thus became linked with Japan at the very dawn of international intercourse. Commodore Aulick, who was placed in command of the East India Squadron in 1851, was instructed to visit Japan and secure, if possible, a treaty of amity and commerce, including the right to obtain coal, the opening of one or more ports for commerce, and protection for shipwrecked seamen and property. By some oversight, the letter to the Emperor drafted by Daniel Webster failed to mention the protection of seamen as one of the desiderata. On his arrival at Hong Kong, Aulick found a letter of recall, for the administration had determined to entrust this delicate mission to Commodore Matthew Perry. According to his instructions, the object of Perry's expedition was to secure protection for shipwrecked American seamen and property, permission to secure supplies, especially coal, and the opening of one or more ports for commerce. These objects were to be obtained by argument and persuasion, but in any event, American citizens wrecked on the coasts of Japan must be treated with humanity, or the offenders would be severely chastised. The mission was to be of a pacific character, and Perry was to use force only in self-defense. He was, furthermore, to be courteous and conciliatory, but at the same time firm and decided. He will therefore submit with patience and forbearance to acts of discourtesy to which he may be subjected, by a people whose usages it will not do to test by our standards of propriety, but at the same time will be careful to do nothing that will compromise, in their eyes, his own dignity or that of the country. He will, on the contrary, do everything to impress them with a just sense of the power and greatness of this country, and to satisfy them that its past forbearance has been the result, not of timidity, but of a desire to be on friendly terms with them. To create this sense of the power and greatness of the United States, the 5 ships of the East India Squadron were to be reinforced by 8 additional ships. During the 9 months which elapsed before the first of these was ready for sea, Perry busied himself in gathering all available information which might bear upon his mission. To this thorough preparation, the success of the expedition was in large part due. On the 8th of July, 1853, with only 4 ships of war, Perry anchored off the town of Uraga, at the entrance to the Bay of Yedo. The Japanese had been advised of this American mission by the Dutch at Nagasaki, yet its appearance caused consternation. According to law, the ships should have been sent away, and if they would not go, then the armed forces of the shogun and the feudal lords, daimyo, should have repulsed them. Yet there were influential officials at the shogun's court who realized the danger of precipitating hostilities with a power represented by such destructive armaments. And Perry's wise conduct gave them support in their temporizing proposals. On his first visit, Perry remained for only 10 days. He impressed the Japanese with the strength of his squadron, containing the largest vessels and the first steamships ever seen in Japanese waters, and perhaps of equal importance with his own goodwill. In dealing with the Japanese officials, he was dignified, firm, and fearless. He insisted upon receiving the treatment due the representative of a great power, and he so far succeeded that, contrary to all precedent, the president's letter was honorably received by 2 high officials. Then he sailed away to allow the Japanese ample time for the consideration of so revolutionary a proposal as the abrogation of their exclusion laws, as well as to await the arrival of additional ships from home with the gifts selected for presentation to the sovereign and his officials. After leaving Japan, Perry returned to Hong Kong and Macau, visiting the Ryukyu, Luchu Islands on the voyage. If the American merchants and the American commissioner in China could have had their way, Perry would have remained constantly on the China coast, for all foreign interests seemed in jeopardy during the Taiping Rebellion. But the Commodore was confident that a portion of his squadron could protect the few Americans there, while the larger part was engaged in carrying out his important mission to Japan. Learning that both French and Russian squadrons were planning to visit Japan, Perry hastened his departure from Hong Kong, sailing on the 14th of January, 1854. At Ryukyu, where the squadron rendezvoused, Perry received a letter from the Governor-General of Netherlands, India, advising him of the death of the shogun shortly after he had left Uraga, and transmitting the request of the Japanese officials that he postpone his promised visit until the period of mourning had expired. The Commodore decided, however, to proceed to Japan. On February 13th, the squadron, now consisting of 7 vessels, anchored in the Bay of Yedo. 2 other ships joined the fleet later, and 8 were present when the treaty was signed on March 31st. During Perry's absence, the American request for friendship, commerce, supplies, and the protection of shipwrecked seamen had been seriously considered by the shogun's officials. Without question, the shogun could have dealt with this matter on his own responsibility, reporting his decision to the Mikado for his formal approval. But the steady weakening of the shogunate during the past 50 years had undermined its old fearlessness and readiness to accept responsibility. A few of the high officials at Yedo realized the necessity and wisdom of modifying the old exclusion laws, but the bulk of the feudal lords and the retainers were staunch conservatives, and this was made clear when the unusual step was taken of transmitting the president's letter to the Mikado and the daimyo for their consideration. The imperial court promptly instructed the shogun to drive the Americans away, and the senior prince of Mito, one of the ablest and strongest daimyo in the land, though nominally in retirement, led the opposition of the feudal lords to any dealings with the foreigners. At first, orders were issued to strengthen the defenses of the coast and of Yedo. Troops were drilled and cannon cast. But in November, orders were issued that if the Americans returned, they were to be received peacefully. The shogun's cabinet had therefore decided to give a favorable reply to the American requests. So on Perry's second visit, the negotiations were carried on with the utmost friendliness, and the conduct of the American officers and men was above reproach. There were, of course, differences of opinion to be harmonized, but these were satisfactorily arranged. The Japanese, for example, wished to have the negotiations take place at Uraga or Kamakura, but Perry objected to both places because of the unfavorable harbors and suggested Yedo, the capital, as the proper place. By a compromise, the little village of Yokohama, some 18 miles from Yedo, was agreed upon. There Perry landed 3 times with proper ceremonial to discuss details with the shogun's commissioners. A reply to the president's letter was presented, which granted all the requests, kind treatment of shipwrecked men, the furnishing of provisions, supplies, and coal, and the opening of Nagasaki, which was a port in the southern part of the empire, as the president had desired. Perry naturally wished to have these concessions protected by a formal treaty rather than stand as national law subject to modification or repeal at any time. He tried, therefore, to use the American Treaty of 1844 with China as a basis for discussion, but the Japanese promptly replied that they were not ready for the establishment of such extensive commercial relations. Perry insisted upon a treaty and even went so far as to suggest that the president would be satisfied with nothing less, and that a failure to secure it might necessitate the sending of more ships and men from America with perhaps more stringent instructions. This strong statement aroused the indignation of Dr. S. Wells Williams, an American missionary to China, who served as first interpreter of the expedition. Yet Perry was right in desiring a formal treaty, and his views prevailed. During the progress of the negotiations, gifts were exchanged, and those from the United States included 2 telegraph instruments, a miniature locomotive, tender, cars and rails, books, weapons, tools and implements, wines and spirits, and many other objects of interest to the Japanese, all of which they carefully studied as evidence of the material strength and wealth of the Western nations. Finally, on the 31st of March, a treaty of peace and amity was signed, the text being in English and Japanese with translations in Dutch and Chinese. This epoch-making treaty, which brought to an end the long period of Japan's seclusion, consisted of 12 articles. First of all, it established a perfect, permanent, and universal peace, and a sincere and cordial amity between the United States and Japan. The other clauses covered the concession of the American requests. The port of Shimoda was to be opened for supplies at once. Perry had refused to consider Nagasaki and Hakodate near the whaling grounds a year later. Shipwrecked Americans were to be well treated, trade was permitted under temporary Japanese regulations and through the agency of Japanese officers, and an American consul or agent might be sent to Shimoda after 18 months, provided either government deemed it necessary. The most favored nation clause, which would automatically confer on Americans any privileges granted to other powers, was included, and in additional regulations signed at Shimoda on June 17th, a crude form of extraterritoriality was provided. In comparison with the customary treaties of commerce of that period, this was but a beginning. But in the light of Japanese history for the past 200 years, and in view of the repeated enforcement of the exclusion laws against Russians, British, and French in the last few decades, it was a great achievement. Without the use of force, Perry had won far more than one might well expect. It has been customary in many quarters to consider this treaty as having been imposed by force upon the Japanese. It has even been said that Perry threatened to open hostilities if his demands were refused. There is no evidence which can support such views. A naval officer was entrusted with this mission because of its dependence upon a fleet for possible success. A strong squadron was placed at Perry's disposal because of the hostile nature of the exclusion laws and the necessity for defense in case of attack. The ships entered the Bay of Yedo, cleared for action with every man at his post, yet Perry was under the strictest orders to resort to force only in self-defense. These orders, given in his sailing instructions, were repeated again and again in later dispatches. If Perry had taken the offensive, and there is not the slightest reason to believe that he ever considered doing so, he would have violated the injunctions of the President and of his immediate superior, the Secretary of the Navy. He was engaged in a pacific mission. Success was to be obtained by argument and persuasion, and if he failed, then only was he to warn the Japanese that future acts of cruelty to American seamen would be severely repaid. The presence of the powerful ships, and especially the steamships, must have made a profound impression upon the Japanese officials. This evidence of the progress of the West, brought to the very doors of the shogun's capital, certainly supported the arguments of those who favored the opening of the country. But if there had not been enlightened men in the councils of the shogunate, there is every reason to believe that the ignorant conservatives would have carried the day, and an attempt would have been made to repulse Perry on his second visit. For his success in negotiating this great treaty, much credit is due to the Commodore himself. He was certainly wise, patient, dignified, and determined. Courteous in dealing with the Japanese officials, he insisted upon the respect due his rank and the importance of his mission, and he convinced the Japanese who came in contact with him of his real goodwill toward their nation and people. On this point, the testimony of the missionary Dr. Williams is of decisive value. But Perry's wisdom and the impressive strength of his squadron would have counted for little had there not been Japanese in high places who could appreciate the one and rightly interpret the other. These were men who had kept in touch as best they could with the progress of the world by means of information which seeped into the country through the Dutch trading post at Nagasaki. They knew something of Western science and politics, something of the amazing advances made in the West since the days of steam, and they knew how China, the great middle kingdom of the East, had been battered to her knees by only one of the maritime powers. And the steady advance of Russia from the north aroused interest in foreign relations. Such feudal lords as Abe, Hotta, and Lee Naosuke were powerful forces working for the success of Perry's mission.